Good day. This month of October, we are celebrating Breast Cancer Awareness Month. I have been tasked to discuss writing the research proposal, and the objectives for this session will be as follows. At the end of the session, the students shall be able to discuss the salient features of the various parts of a complete research proposal, prepare the budget and timetable or the Gantt chart of a research project, draft an abstract and an executive summary of a research proposal, and lastly, write a complete research proposal. So, what are the parts of a research proposal? In general, your research proposal should contain the following: the title, the names of the proponents. In particular, for this research endeavor that you're currently doing, we will be identifying the principal investigators, which will be the students, and your co-investigators, which will be your faculty members from the Department of Preventive and Community Medicine, as well as from the other academic units of the UERM College of Medicine. Then we will be focusing on your research problem, including its various facets or the subproblems. And we will look into your objectives, both the general and the specific objectives. In the previous lectures, we have already highlighted that your objectives need to meet the SMART criteria. When we say SMART criteria, your objectives ought to be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. For those of you who will be employing an analytical research design, you will also need to formulate your hypothesis, both the null and the alternative hypothesis. With regard to your alternative hypothesis, we also differentiate between your one-tailed and your two-tailed alternative hypothesis. Then we establish the significance of significance of the study, and this will basically look into previously published articles, and we will try to see what is the clinical relevance or what is the public health impact of your research proposal. This will also look into the background of the study. Then we will also include the methodology for your research proposal. This is the technical dimension of your research proposal, wherein we look into the plan of investigation. We will try to see how you will formulate your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and how many study subjects or study participants will you need to employ or recruit to complete your research study. We will also have to operationally define relevant variables, both the dependent and the independent variables. And to a certain degree, we will also look into possible confounding variables. We also take into consideration ethics, medical ethics when we conduct research, especially those that involve human study subjects. The data collection tools will also be relevant on top of the methodology. If there is a need to yet utilize, let's say, a previously validated tool or questionnaire, it is expected that these will also be included in your research proposal. On top of that, we will also look into how you will analyze your data, looking into your dummy tables, looking into the actual data processing. And once you have generated the needed information, how do you interpret hypothetically the data that you will be generating, and what possible conclusions can you make based on the hypothetical results that you will be gathering? Other parts of the research proposal will also include your timetable or your Gantt chart. We will briefly discuss this in a short while. Your personnel and facilities, meaning to say, for example, if there is a need to, let's say, recruit, let's say, a language expert. Let's say you have a tool that is, let's say, written in French, and you want to convert it to the Filipino vernacular. So there might be a need for you to get a language expert, or a linguist individual who will be able to translate your tool into something that will be relevant to your study subjects. Or, for example, for facilities, let's say, for example, you are studying You are doing a wet laboratory type of research. Is there a need, let's say, for, I don't know, your let's say your polymerase chain reaction machine, or will you be utilizing a hood, or will you be using culture medium or culture media? So these are some of the facilities that you might require in the completion of your research proposal. The budget is also very important because, just to let you know, we are one of the very few medical institutions which provide adequate subsidy and financial assistance for the completion of student research. In fact, I think I believe we are the only medical school that provides subsidy to our students to complete their research papers. Of course, the budget will have to be very modest. It will also have to be approved by several bodies, but we do allocate a few funding opportunities for our medical students to implement the research proposal. The references will also be very pertinent. As much as possible, we would prefer that you use the most recent available published data within the last 5 years or so, if that is possible. But of course, it's really case to case basis. But in general, we really want the most updated type of references to be cited in your research proposals. Appendices will also be relevant. Let's say, for example, if you have a very lengthy data collection tool, you might want to put a copy of the data collection tool and or questionnaire in your appendices. Or for example, let's say you are doing, let's say, an environmental, let's say an ecologic study. Let's say you want to measure, for example lang, if you want to, let's say, measure amount of rainfall and let's say the burden of dengue. So you might want to also include a geographical picture of the target population. That could also be included in the appendices. So again, whatever you will be putting in your appendices, it's really case-to-case basis. Sometimes we also require our medical students to incorporate your short and brief curriculum vitae at the end of the research proposal so that we will have a good idea as to what will be your previous experiences when it comes to the conduct of epidemiological medical research. So let's go over the different parts of a research proposal one by one, starting with the title. The title of the research proposal should be very clear to the point that it should contain important elements which are included in the following questions. Does it include the subject matter under study? Does it mention the subjects or the target population under study? Does it identify the type of study design? Does it specify the time frame of the study? In previous lectures, we have already instructed you to formulate your research questions following the PEOM format, that is your population exposure outcome methods. If you're doing a clinical trial and or an experimental study, then it could be your population intervention with or without the comparator, the outcomes and the methods. Basically, because this is an academic exercise, we want the PEOM or the PIOM or the PICOM elements be present in your title. Because if you just read the title and you can already identify the population, the exposure, the outcome, and the methodology, even without reading the entire paper, we already have an idea as to what the research proposal will be. What the research proposal will be tackling. Now, if you present in other funding agencies, sometimes funding agencies would want to have a catchy title. So instead of having the long academic title, just like what we want in the Department of Preventive and Community Medicine, in other funding agencies, they just want catchy short titles. For example, you can come up with, let's say you're looking into the effects of nocturnal hypoglycemia with the use of various anti-diabetic agents. So if you're looking at nocturnal hypoglycemic episodes, Maybe you can come up with a catchy title, let's say Breaking Dawn or something like that. So it depends. It really depend on the funding agency to which you are presenting your research proposal. But for academic purposes in the UERM, Department of Preventive and Community Medicine, we prefer the long titles, the academic title, which will bear the population, the exposure, the outcome, and the methodology as much as possible. Because at the end of the day, this is still an academic activity or an academic requirement. Then we look into your research problem and subproblems. Again, when you say a problem is researchable, it tells us that there is opportunity for us to objectively collect data with regard to the variables of interest. Researchability of the problem depends on whether or not data on the variables of interest can be collected objectively. Is the research problem feasible? So this is another facet of the research problem. It's not just an issue of whether or not you can objectively measure the variables. When I say measure, you can, let's say, use a data collection tool. Let's say a tool would have corresponding scores, and the scores would have corresponding interpretation. That's one way of objectively collecting data. Or let's say, for example, if you measure something objectively, let's say in the field of diabetology, you want to, let's say, measure the level of the glycosylated hemoglobin, which is the average blood sugar level over the last 3 months. So it could be objectively measured by getting a venipuncture and venous sample blood, and you subject your blood to chemistry, blood chemistry, then you get the HbA1c or the glycosylated hemoglobin. That is what we mean by researchable. It's something that you can quantify and objectively measure. The other facet is that of being feasible. Feasibility refers to the availability of time, money, materials, equipment, and manpower. If any of these cannot be adequately met, then the project is most likely to fail. For example, you might be interested, let's say, to look into, let's say, shortening the hospitalization period of individuals who undergo, let's say, laparoscopic cholecystectomy versus your open cholecystectomy. That is a very good research topic if you are a surgery resident physician in trainee, because you are already doing surgical procedures such as your cholecystectomy, whether it is done using the old school open cholecystectomy or the newer advanced with the more advanced technology of laparoscopic cholecystectomy. But you don't have the skills or the legal license to perform such procedures yet as medical students. So in terms of feasibility, it might not be appropriate for your level. Or let's look at the time frame. For example, you want to study, let's say, the impact of the use of vaping and the development of lung cancer. You want to establish whether or not vaping could be a possible etiology for the development of lung cancer. Again, that is a very good topic. It's something that is very relevant from a public health perspective. It's very novel in terms of looking into the positive, because there is paucity of current evidence linking vaping and lung cancer. But the problem is, how long should you wait and observe your study subjects for them to actually develop lung cancer? It might take a decade, 2 decades. So, in terms of time, since this is a research project that needs to be completed, let's say with a maximum of, let's say, 10 months, I don't think that would be feasible in terms of the time. So, again, it's not just an issue of whether or not your research problem is quantifiable, but we also consider factors of feasibility. We also look into the various sub-problems of your research question. Normally, your research question would have different issues or different concerns. And once you break them down, once you analyze each sub-problem, when you answer each sub-problem collectively, then you go back to the research question and answer it in its entirety. So main research problems can be directly answered by scientific investigations, while conclusions may only be derived after a series of well-thought problem facets is addressed. So it's really a matter of excuse me, it's really a matter of how do you how do you break down a big problem to come up with smaller sub problems that you can also objectively quantify and measure. Now, objectives will have to be, again, they would need to meet the SMART criteria. When I say SMART, it must be specific, it must be measurable, it is attainable, it is realistic, and it is time bound. Both general and specific objectives need to be directly related to the research problem. For an adequately formulated set of research problems, the general objective may be the declarative form of the research question. Remember, your research question is phrased as in interrogative form. If you play with the words and you're very good with grammar and syntax, if you just reverse or convert a question to make it a declarative statement, then often that would be your research, your general objective. Specific objectives, on the other hand, are the finer details. This will enable the reader to assess the appropriateness of indicators used, as well as the feasibility and researchability of a study. For my preceptorial classes, I normally tell them that if you want to look at, let's say, the relationship of variable one and variable two, I just simply cut the specific objectives into just three main I normally just require three basic specific objectives. Specific objective number one would often describe the demographic profile of your study respondents. So it's usually a given. And this would often be reflected as the proverbial table one of any research study. So table number one, open any journal that involves humans, and normally you would note that table number one would often describe the social demographic profile of your study subjects. So usually that's my specific objective number one, to describe the social demographic profile of the study respondents or the study participants. Objective number two would often look into my independent variable. Let's say if you are to construct in often we tell you to employ something that is of epidemiological research design. Often we prefer the quantitative research studies. For most medical students research, the most feasible will be to hold or to conduct analytical observational studies. So in your analytical observational studies, we teach you how to generate your odds ratio. If this is a case control study, we tell you to look for the risk ratio. If it is a cohort study, if it is an analytical cross sectional study, we tell you to look for the prevalence odds ratio or the prevalence rate ratio, depending on the variables of interest. So, but for you to come up with these, you need to come up with your 2 by 2 contingency table. So if I were to guide or to simplify things, often my specific objective number two would focus into the proportion of study subjects who would meet the criteria to as to whether or not they have the independent variable, while your specific objective number three would often pertain to the proportion of your study respondents who would exhibit the outcome of interest. So I just limit my specific objectives to three. One that looks into the specific to the social demographic profile. Number two, the proportion of those with the independent variable. And number three, those that are the proportion of study subjects who possess the outcome variable of interest. And when you if you analyze these two together, then you go back to the original general problem, which is to often establish relationship between variable one and variable two. So it's really a matter of how you can simplify something that is very complex. I often tell my students that do not make your research proposals too complicated and too sophisticated to the point that you will have to deal with, let's say, a more a more scientific way of interpreting your data, or there if there is a need for greater statistical analysis, because not everyone would be very adept or very keen with biostatistics. So the simpler your research proposal, the one that if your proposal is very straight to the point, direct to the point, and it just captures the main general objective, then that would be okay. At the end of the day, for every specific objective that you formulate, there should be a corresponding table in your results that would answer each and every specific objective that you have formulated. So to simplify things, for academic purposes, I just tell my students, I tell my group mates, my advisory group, so to just make your research, your specific objectives very simple, very straightforward, and and less intricate, to make even the data analysis easier for everyone. Indicators must also be measurable. Again, this is something that we have been reiterating over and over, that there should be, when you say something is researchable, you can objectively quantify, you can objectively measure the variables of interest. We move on to your hypothesis. Again, this is only required if you are doing an analytical study design, if you are doing a descriptive study, let's say a prevalence survey, or just a simple case report or an or case series, then you don't have to have your hypothesis. Anything that would look into possible relationships of variables, then that would entail having the hypothesis. Otherwise, this is not required. So the hypothesis of an analytical study is also very relevant when it comes to sample size estimation. It is also pertinent if you are to look into the way you will be and how you will be analyzing data. And just like what I mentioned earlier on, your alternative hypothesis, it could either be one-tailed or two-tailed. And again, this is relevant for you to determine whether or not you would need to reject your null hypothesis. So I think you had a very good lecture on this. So kindly go back to the previous lecture if you are still having a little bit of issues on how to really formulate your alternative hypothesis. If based on your literature review, there is already more or less a particular direction on how relationship between two variables will be established, then maybe it will be prudent to use a one-tailed hypothesis versus a two-tailed hypothesis, which you still don't know if it will be positively or negatively related to a particular the relationship of the variables. If you don't know if it's positive or negative, then of course we go with the two-tailed hypothesis. So at the end of the day, it really depends on how you do your literature review and what is your hypothesis. If you're already siding on a direct relationship between variable one and variable two, then you might opt to have a one-tailed alternative hypothesis rather than your two-tailed hypothesis. Now we'll look into the significance of the study. This is very much also similar. It's already establishing the literature review. You are beginning to establish the literature review. The significance of the study would often highlight the rationale on why you are conducting the research in the very first place. It establishes the magnitude of the problem, including its probable public health impact and whatever clinical utility your future data may have once you obtain the information. We also look into the critical mass, meaning to say, does the research problem that you are studying affect a large segment of the population? Or is there a current gap in the level of knowledge about a certain medical condition and new information that you may be deriving from your proposal might fill in that gap? Or if there would be practical application improving the practice of the medical profession, especially if your study would focus into quality assurance, let's say service patient satisfaction improvement, all of these. So these are the reasons why you are interested in pursuing a particular research topic or a research problem. So these are some of the things that you might want to include in your significance of the study. You are building the excitement. Why is your paper relevant? Why is it important that your paper be implemented in the first place? And this will now lead to the background of the study. This is where your review of related literature will come in. This will elaborate on the present state of knowledge regarding the research problem. If your research problem is often faced with clinical dilemma, we don't know um if something is good or bad, or there are controversies with regard to your research problem, then this is the most opportune time to do the research to further understand the problem. We look into existing published and unpublished literature, or when you say unpublished, this could be the gray literature. When I say gray literature, most medical institutions, whether we're looking into UERM, UP, UST, Ateneo, De La Salle, FEU, lahat yan, no, maraming research ang mga faculty and students, but not all of the studies are published in peer-reviewed journals. Sometimes in their institutional libraries, they have copies of previous studies which were never published, pero it could still be relevant. And you can also access these, and this is what we refer to as the gray literature. So knowledge of developing the topic by reviewing related literature would further strengthen why is your research proposal relevant and important. So you need to be very inquisitive. You need to be very critical. Whatever data that you put in your literature review, it has to be critically appraised. We don't want a hodgepodge of various journals, put them all together, and then present it as it's like a word salad. We don't want that. We want papers that would synthesize data from one research to the other. And how do all of these data or all of these information further develop the topic of interest? And this is where your literature would come in. I remember a few years back now, there was this one uh, hilarious senator who who did not understand why research is relevant, and yet she alleged to be a smart individual. And I beg to disagree that she is a smart individual if she does not know the value of research. Research often opens doors, and they often um, provide clear explanations as to why it is imperative that as lifelong learners, we also have to look into various studies, synthesize them, put them in one research paper for us to better improve the practice of the medical profession. Then we move on to the methodology. So this would be the technical dimension of what we are teaching you since second semester of first year. So we've introduced you to the various research designs. During first year, second sem, we said that most quantitative epidemiological data can be dichotomized into your descriptive and your analytical studies. So your Descriptive studies would look into your correlational studies and your descriptive cross-sectional surveys. But when you talk of your analytical studies, we could have your observational analytical studies, which would include your cross-sectional study, your case control study, or your cohort study. But there could also be your experimental trials, or randomized control trial, your field trial, or your community trial. Then you also have your systematic reviews and your meta-analysis. And we also differentiated your quantitative versus your qualitative studies. So for the qualitative studies, they have a different style in terms of generating and interpreting data. But now there are certain studies which utilize both the quantitative and the qualitative dimension of research. They put them together, and that's what you call your mixed method studies. So when we talk of the methodology, at the end of the day, when you come up with your research proposal, you should be able to generate your general schema regardless of variables of interest. All of your your quantitative epidemiological research designs would often follow just a single general schema. Let's say, for example, you are looking into an analytical cross-sectional study. Regardless of what your independent and your dependent variables are, the general schema would always look like this. From a given single population, you identify a sample, and from the sample, you measure both the independent and the dependent variables simultaneously at a single point in time or in a single period of time. And you try to identify from the sample who among the samples would have both the dependent and the independent variable. So your independent variable, we can call them your risk factor, and your dependent variable would be often a disease condition. In the same manner, you also identify those with the risk factor and yet they do not have the disease. Or you will identify those who do not have the risk factor and yet they have the disease. And of course, we identify those without the risk factor and without the disease outcome. And from knowing the data, you can again come up with your 2 by 2 contingency table. And to determine the measure of association, you can use either your prevalence odds ratio or your prevalence risk ratio. If you are utilizing a case control study, this is the general schema of any case control study. Look that there are two different populations. Their populations need not be identical. They need not be identical. Your populations need not be comparable because your study subjects need not be comparable in a case control study because both your cases and your controls come from different populations. What is important is that your cases are truly representative of the cases, while your controls are truly representative of the controls. You recruit your study subjects as of present time, and you divide them based on the presence or absence of the outcome or the disease. And then you go back in time, whether in the remote past or the historical past, and identify who among the cases would have the risk factor, who will not have the risk factor. On the other hand, among the controls, you will also identify who among them would have the risk factors and who will not have the risk factors. And by doing so, just looking at the general schema, you know that this is something that is retrospective in design. And from a case control study, we often measure the odds ratio, and your odds ratio would be the main measure of association. Then we move to your concurrent cohort. Notice that your concurrent cohort, the study subjects belong to only one population. Because they come from one population only, the study subjects will need to be comparable to each other, meaning to say they will be identical in all qualities. The social demographic profile will be the same for all qualities except for the presence or absence of the risk factor. Then you follow them up in time and you try to see among those with the risk factors who will develop the disease, who will not. In the same manner, among those who do not have the risk factor, who will have the disease, who will not have the disease. So, this prospective or forward looking design will allow us to generate your risk ratio. And your risk ratio will be the main measure of association for your concurrent cohort study. Now, notice that your cohort study is very similar to your clinical trials or your experimental trials. This is an example of a randomized controlled trial, no? Again, for medical students, we're not too keen already on letting our medical students venture into epidemiologic research studies that utilize a clinical trial design because this would require good clinical practice certification to begin with. And since there would be an intervention, an induced treatment, you are not yet legally allowed to prescribe treatment or prescribe drugs or recommend therapy. So we prefer that students do not do clinical trials yet. But notice that just like your cohort study, this is something that is prospective in design. You identify a sample from a given population, from a single population. That is why your sample would really have to be comparable again in terms of the social demographic profile, and they would be differing only from each other with the presence or absence of the induced intervention. This is the main difference between your experimental design versus your observational analytical cohort study. There is an induced intervention. You are the one who is introducing the intervention. And when you do a randomized controlled trial, randomization will give equal opportunities for your study subjects to belong either to the treatment arm or to the control arm. Randomization is also a good technique to minimize any possible confounding variables that you may have in your research study. And again, you follow them up in time and you try to see whether or not the induced intervention could, let's say, address the outcome of interest, whether or not they will develop the disease or whether or not they would remain disease free. So, this is again the general schema of any clinical trial or any randomized controlled clinical trial. Similarly, under methods, we also try to establish how do you identify the study participants who will be eligible to participate in your study. In your previous lectures, we have already differentiated your target population versus your accessible population. Normally, we have to identify and formulate a very good inclusion exclusion criteria for us to really say as to who will be able to participate in your study. If your research study is free from any methodological flaw, and when once you come up with good data, then we can be ensured, or we could be assured rather, that there is internal validity of the data. Internal validity is often a reflection of the technical soundness of the methodology design of your research study. On the other hand, whether or not your data or the findings of your research, if your research, can you apply this to the bigger population? Remember, you only identified a small sample of the target population. Let's say, for example, when you want to study behavior of Filipino medical students, I can guarantee you cannot recruit all medical students from the 70 plus medical schools that we have in the Philippines. But rather, when you have an accessible population, perhaps you have friends who are studying in other medical schools within the national capital region. So dun lang kayo so you limit your data collection to that accessible population. Whatever finding you reveal or unearth from the accessible population, can you automatically say it is applicable to all members of the target population? That is your external validity, the generalizability of your data. So sometimes you can have data that are internally valid, but not automatically externally valid. Internal validity is a requirement for us to have external validity or generalizability. Again, we also want you to properly formulate your inclusion and exclusion criteria. We'd like to emphasize that your exclusion criteria are not mere negation of whatever you have included in your inclusion criteria. When you say inclusion criteria, that you would need to identify specific characteristics that would enable study subjects to participate in your research. While your exclusion criteria often would look into why will they not be eligible. For example, you want to um let's say measure the relationship between graveyard shift work and uh manual ability of your workers, no, to perform manual skills. And you can measure the manual skills using the Purdue pegboard test. Of course, you cannot require if there are workers, let's say, for example, who are visually impaired, you cannot expect them to do the manual Purdue pegboard test as efficient as those who are not suffering from visual impairment. So visual impairment could be an exclusion criterion when it comes to that particular study. Or for example, you want to determine level of satisfaction with um, let's say palliative services and quality of life. And you need to have the study respondents answer a self-administered questionnaire. If your study respondent, let's say, is in chronic vegetative state, na yung mga lantang gulay, post-stroke, how can they answer a questionnaire? So that could be, again, another exclusion criterion. So it's not exactly just a negative or the opposite of your inclusion criteria, but we want you to think outside of the box. What would what characteristics would bar an eligible participant to actually be part of your research study? That would be your exclusion criteria. You also had a very good lecture already on the different sampling techniques. We highlighted that there is a difference between your non-probability versus your probability sampling. In essence, when you say probability sampling, everyone in the accessible population would have the equal opportunity to be part of that research study. Once you provide that, this is what you call your probability sampling. And probability sampling would look into simple random sampling, um, stratified random sampling, cluster sampling, perhaps even multi-stage sampling. On the other hand, your non-probability sampling, there could be already some form of selection bias that you are introducing. Let's say if you want to perform purposive sampling, convenience sampling, snowball technique. Um, but of course, there would be pros and cons whether you employ your non-probability versus your probability sampling. Of course, we want you to, if your proposal is something that is going to be funded and you are presenting it to possible funding agencies, you want the higher type of sampling method to be included in your methodology. We would prefer a probability type of sampling method, but it is more difficult to really facilitate your probability sampling. And so we still allow your non-probability sampling techniques, no, including your convenience sampling. Just to give you an idea, maybe for this one, you can sit down with your faculty co-investigators and really confer as to how you will be recruiting your study subjects. Now, the best sampling scheme is one which will enable inclusion of a representative set of study individuals, and this consideration should be weighed against issues of practicality and availability of your resources. Um, with regard to study sample size estimation, in the previous lecture, we have already introduced you to various formulae that you can utilize to estimate your sample size. In your research, in your review notes and manual, we also included several pages of the manual would include different formula, whether you're looking at um descriptive studies or analytical studies that would be for hypothesis testing, whether you're utilizing single population, more than one population, whether you're looking at data that would utilize proportions or means. So there are different formulae that can be utilized or can be employed. So I want you to go back to the lecture, read the manual, and you can find why it's important, it's important that you are identify the correct formula to use. Sample size that are arbitrarily set should be avoided. We really don't want this. And the correct formula to use will depend on the following. The objectives, whether you are doing an estimation or just a mere, for example, this is a mere descriptive study or hypothesis testing. If this is an analytical study design, the parameter being studied, whether you're looking at proportions versus means, or the research design. Is this something descriptive or is something that is analytical in nature? And of course, the sampling technique, whether you will be employing probability versus non-probability sampling. I know that you might be in this day and age of digital data and computer applications or internet-based applications. I know that there are programs that would already help you generate the data. No, most of what you plug in for the said formula would come from existing literature. So you just plug in the values that will be required in the formula, then you can generate your sample size estimation. There are sample size estimator apps, for example, OpenEpi. Of course, you can utilize that. We will not stop you. But again, for academic purposes, we would encourage our students to be familiar with the various formulae because this sometimes would also appear in the physician licensure examination. And so learning how to do the longhand or the manual way of sample size estimation, for me, there's also still learning in that, or there is a learning curve. So might as well maximize the learning opportunities. I would prefer that you do the manual calculation rather than relying on the data apps or the computer apps that you can utilize from the World Wide Web. Operational definitions. These pertain to how the independent and dependent variables are used specifically in your research study to avoid ambiguities and differences in interpretations of the terms. Variables ought to be operationally defined. And we'd like to reiterate that definitions are not textbook definitions of terms, but rather they are descriptions of what these terms mean in the context of the study. For example, if you are talking, let's say, of diabetes mellitus, we don't want you don't want operational definitions of diabetes mellitus, like, for example, oh, there is insulin resistance, or there is insulin sensitivity, or you look into the egregious 11, to the 11 pathophysiologic mechanisms that bring about hyperglycemia, or you talk about the beta cell apoptosis of the pancreas, or the glucagon abnormalities because of the dysfunctional alpha cells of the pancreas. We all know those are the basic pathophysiologic mechanisms on why diabetes mellitus is observed. But that's not the operational definition of diabetes that we are interested in. For example, but you might say that diabetes mellitus is defined as uncontrolled diabetes mellitus will be defined as HbA1c of 7% and above. That's an operational definition. Hindi namin kailangan yung textbook definition na there is insulin resistance, insulin insensitivity, progressive beta cell destruction, beta cell apoptosis and destruction. No, we don't want that. Rather, operationally, FBS of, let's say, 200 and above. Those are operational definitions, not textbook definitions. Ethical considerations, the investigators must explain how ethical standards are followed. Important considerations in dealing with human subjects include, but are not limited to, data privacy and confidentiality, recruitment, informed consent process, risk-benefit ratio, presence or absence of vulnerable populations to include indigenous people, children, geriatric populations, women, or even the minority, the LGBTQIS plus community. Sometimes they're also referred to as the vulnerable population, or even persons with disability, or those who are incarcerated, those who are in prison, juveniles in conflict with the law. These are all considered vulnerable populations as well. And experimental trials would often require GCP certification, or your Good Clinical Practice certification, which is renewed every 3 years. So again, we are not really keen on letting our students do experimental trials, randomized controlled trials, because we are of the opinion that if you want to uphold ethical issues with regard to biomedical research, then we would prefer that you're already licensed physicians if you will be venturing into clinical trials or your experimental trials. With regard to data collection, there should be a very clear, a brief description on how steps, procedures, or phases of the study would be gathered in terms of sequence, in terms of logical presentation. If you will be utilizing primary versus secondary data, it should also be clearly stipulated in your research proposal. For the data collection instruments, mention inherent characteristics of the tool, especially if the said tools have been previously validated already. When I say previously validated, you might already encounter data that would look into, let's say, reliability of your data collection tools in terms of the Cronbach's alpha, its ability to identify true positives and true negatives with its sensitivity and specificity, or even the predictive values, both your positive and your negative predictive values. Now, in the event that you are unable to identify previously validated questionnaires or previously validated tools, you can still utilize new tools. You can come up with your own questionnaire, provided you should also clearly state in your methodology how will you ensure how will you provide quality assurance with the use of your data collection tool. For example, will you have an expert review initially the content of your questionnaire through face validity? In a strictest sense, validation studies are already one research topic in its entirety. Validation would look into content, criterion, validity, no, or uh, content, criterion, construct validity. So medyo mahirap yung validation process. But at the very minimum, what we would require at the very minimum, what we would require our students is for a face validity, at least have an expert go over your questionnaire, have it proofread, get the inputs of that expert. Let's say if you have let's say a paper that would look into, for example, pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV/AIDS, or HIV rather. So at least get the expert's opinion, get an expert in the field of infectious medicine or tropical medicine or even microbiology, parasitology, virology to look into your questionnaire before you subject it to their actual data collection. There should also be provision for pilot testing. You can determine the reliability using the Cronbach's alpha of your research of this new tool. Any type of quality assurance procedure should be clearly stated in your proposal if you are going to utilize a new questionnaire that you will formulate. Now, again, if ever in the future you will be doing clinical trials, describe the control and the intervention arms, including on how you will ensure randomization. Again, randomization is a process that can minimize any potential effect of confounding variables by giving equal opportunities for your study subject to belong either to your treatment arm or to your control arm. Data processing and analysis. How will bias be minimized? Again, bias are systematic errors that that move the relationship between two variables towards one direction at the same time. I hope you remember the difference between your random errors and your systematic errors or your bias. Random errors could make the relationship either stronger or weaker at any given point in time. So it could go in either direction. But bias, on the other hand, or your systematic errors, will always shift the relationship of the variables towards one direction. Palagi siyang positive or palagi siyang negative, but it can never go either way. So if there will be any potential bias, bias could be seen from the sampling, from the actual data collection. How will you minimize the bias? If ever you will be employing software, make sure that you use that the software that you will be using will be ano ha license. We don't want, let's say, gagamit kayo ng SPSS, no? The social packages for social sciences. Baka naman pirated yung gagamitin nyo, no? So we don't want that. We want the licensed version. If there is a need to use SPSS, you can coordinate with the Research Institute for Health Sciences or with the medical library. They can provide licensed SPSS for the use of the students during their research. How do we control confounding variables? Again, just to review, your confounding variables are extraneous variables that are not really part of the relationship that you're trying to establish or trying to study, but for some reason, they are always present and they can inadvertently affect or impact both on the independent and the dependent variable. So there should also be mechanisms as well on how we intend to control such confounding variables. And what statistical methods and tests will be used in the conduct of the study? Again, you should be very familiar with the variables of interest. No, so again, I hope you know the difference between your categorical measurements and your continuous or your discrete measurements. Under your categorical measurements or your categorical variables, they could be nominal data, ordinal data. On the other hand, your continuous or your discrete measurements could be intervals or ratios. Knowing the scale of measurement is imperative for you to identify what particular test of statistical test to employ, no, when you are dealing with your research study. So, for example, if you're doing an analytical cross-sectional study wherein you only have a single population that looks into let's say your outcome variable is something that is of an interval or ratio, then to establish statistical significance, we use the t-test. If you're looking at the variable that is categorical, then you could use the chi-square test. On the other hand, if let's say you're doing a cohort study, and let's say you're doing a cohort study involving two unrelated samples, and the outcome variable as a change in HbA1c level. That's something that is discrete or ordered scale of measurement. So you use a paired t-test. So again, this table is present in your review notes and manuals. I refer you back to your manuals. Make sure there is an opportunity for you to really understand how to use this table. More so if you're using, let's say, for example, if you're doing a correlational study, if you hindi siya talaga analytical na cause-effect relationship. It's something that is descriptive. Then you can use your correlation coefficients, no? Whether if your data is normally distributed, we use the Pearson's R. If it is something that is not normally distributed, we use the Spearman's Law. So again, just to summarize, what are the indicators that you need to generate if you're using different research designs, and how will you establish statistical significance? So itong effect size, ito yung measure of association. But whether or not your measure of association is statistically significant, then you go back to the previous table that I have shown you to establish the statistical significance. Descriptive studies would often require descriptive statistics, while analytic studies would require inferential statistics for their analysis. I think this was clearly discussed already in the previous lecture. Then dummy tables. Dummy tables are used for us to summarize the findings. Hindi to raw data table. Some of you come up with raw data table, no, na parang, let's say if you have 100 respondents, you have 100 na nakasulat. No, dummy tables are already a summary of whatever data that you have generated. Dummy tables are important because they enable the investigator and reader to anticipate and visualize the organized set of data that will be gathered. We also want you to include your hypothetical interpretation and conclusion to ensure that the statistical analysis to be done on a study is appropriate. The investigator must consider the kind of conclusion or interpretation that such a test will generate. Now, we also want you to put on your timetable. All important activities must be clearly measured or must be clearly stated in the Gantt chart or the timetable, which highlights or summarizes milestones or important events that will be part of the research implementation. Remember that your activities have to be realistic and doable, and it is to be considered time bound. Normally, we present the Gantt chart. This is the typical Gantt chart. Let's say, for example, after this semester, we will be identifying research papers which will be for implementation. So that would be sometime from January 2025 all the way to second semester of third year. So that's more or less one whole year of study implementation. Notice that here in the Gantt chart here, your data collection should already commence come April 2025. And you should at least now do the complete data collection by August 2025, because come September, October, November, just like the third year medical students now, they are now synthesizing their data. They're encoding, they're analyzing their data. They're already starting to write their final manuscript, because our final research presentation would be sometime in November of this year. So we're also presenting the same Gantt chart to you. So this will be a guide as to what part of the in the terms of calendar, how you should pace the activities or the parts of the research implementation. When doing the research budget, it is important to determine the timeline, because the cost of the budget will depend on how many months the person will be given an honorarium for research. This is actually very true if you have research assistants now who would be getting honoraria. But of course, this is something that is not part of your research endeavor. No? Ang sa amin lang yung budget nyo, it's more of what you will be utilizing for the actual implementation of your budget. So in your case of your budget, this would include the personnel. Let's say, for example, if there is a need to get a language expert, or if you need to back translate your questionnaire. Sometimes we need to coordinate with the kagawaran ng wikang Filipino, for them to really verify whether there is good back translation of a Filipino tool to English, then English to Filipino, something like that. What materials will be needed, equipment, transportation, if there is a need for you to travel from UERM to another station, as long as it's not too padded, no? Yung talagang very credible naman. We don't want you to learn from some of people in society na ang laki-laki ng budget, hindi mo alam kung saan nanggagaling ang budget, naglulos tayo ng billion-billion in just a single day. We don't want that. Communication, internet service providers sometimes could be included, printing costs, and if there is a need to pay for the institutional research board, no? So sometimes these could also be provided in the budget of the student research studies. With regard to reference citation, we hope that you will continue to follow the National Library of Medicine style of citing um, for your literature review. Make sure that when you cite, it's really credible. There are faculty members who really visit the whatever you cite. We click on the site and we try to see if what you are citing will actually be true. So this is a sample of how the NLM citation should be properly be included in your final research proposal. So again, I refer you back to your previous lecture on how to properly style the citation following that of the National Library of Medicine for its databases. Appendices, sometimes these are some of the things that we might need to see, um, especially if you're coming up with proposals that would be, let's say, requiring um, funding from other agencies. Kung dito lang naman sa UERM yung funding agency, yung endorsement of administrative academic officers, hindi na yan necessary, no? Pero for example, you want to, let's say, apply for funding, let's say with the Metro Manila Health Research and Development Consortium of the Philippine Council for Health Research and Development of the Department of Science and Technology or that of the Department of Health, then maybe hihingan kayo ng endorsement. Pero kung within UERM lang naman, it's something that is not really required of you. So again, for academic purposes, I'm just putting what we want to see in the appendices if ever you will be submitting your proposals. Now, the last few slides, I'll be talking on the differences between your abstract and your executive summary. An abstract is very important because it is usually the first thing that journal editors will read, for especially if this is already a final research paper. And the abstract will determine whether or not your research paper is worthy of being published. And once it is published, we want people to actually utilize the findings of our research paper. And when there are other researchers who might be interested with the same topic, it's the abstract which they often read first. So this is the reason why you also need to develop the abstract properly. The abstract of a research proposal shall summarize the following. Normally, it's less than 500 words, depending on the institution that is doing the research thing. Now, sometimes they want it in just one page, some 1 to 2 pages, depending kung double space or single spaced. But normally, what we want to see in the abstract will be the significance of the study. If this is analytical in design, the hypothesis, the study objectives, a brief methodology, and what will be the potential impact of the data of the study that you are pursuing. Though it appears first, the abstract should be edited last as a concise summary of the research proposal. Now, there is also slight difference between the abstract of a proposal versus the abstract of a final research manuscript. Pag sinabi ng final research manuscript, nagawa na, kompleto na yung study. A proposal is something that is forward looking. It is yet to be done. A research manuscript is already completed. So in the research manuscript that is already final, we normally follow the IMRAD, no, or introduction, methodology, results, discussion, and or conclusion. So the introduction should include the summary of the background of the study, including the actual statement of the general objective, while your conclusion is often the answer to the general objective. So it must be clearly, they should be properly uh, um, they should be properly formulated so that when you read the abstract, it is seamless. Now, writing the abstract, go through the written document and highlight the most important sentences in each of the said section of the IMRAD, the introduction, the methods, the result, and the discussion and or conclusion. And these will serve as the basic template guide when drafting the abstract. Provide an introductory background information that would lead into the statement of the general objective, and briefly describe the methods, the study design, study population, data collection, so on and so forth. Clearly describe the most important finding or the main result of the study. Normally, we look into the general objective and we just answer the general objective by giving the strength of association if this is something that is analytical in nature, and then whether or not this strength of association is statistically significant or not. Then state the conclusion concisely and avoid overstatements. Normally, there should be main take-home messages, and the others would be considered just secondary findings. So just a few tips. These are things to avoid when you are writing an abstract. We don't want lengthy background information. We don't want citations. We don't want you to describe laboratory procedures, especially if it's already routine. You don't have to explain what the PCR test is. It's already given. It's already understood. Details about the statistical methods or software use, undefined abbreviations or acronyms. This is often something that I see even in published papers. So they often include acronyms, which is very difficult to understand if you're reading it for the very first time, and results or interpretation that are not discussed in the text. How is your abstract different from your executive summary? Executive summaries are very much like similar. However, it's considered more of a condensed version of a longer report's content. The key difference is that the executive summaries are written for people who most likely do not have time to read the original. And that is why sometimes um, it is called an executive summary when it is an abstract with scholarly document. Um, an executive summary seeks to let the reader in on what the real significance of the report is. What is the reader expected to or what is the reader expected to respond to? So this is very true for talking to funding agencies. Not all funding agencies would be medically inclined. Let's say, for example, kunwari lang, you are looking for possible funding from San Miguel Corporation. You don't expect people in San Miguel Corporation to be very particular about medical jargon. And so you want the executive summary to be fully understood by someone who would most probably approve your request for funding. So this is what the executive summary should be. The reader is a decision maker who will have the responsibility on deciding on important issues related to the report. That is why there is a subtle difference between your clinical abstract or the research abstract and your executive summary, because ang assumption natin, abstracts are often read by people who belong to our circle of medical people or health professionals. Executive summaries may require non-medical people to read the document. So the executive summary is usually no longer than 10% of the original document. It can be anywhere from 1 to 10 pages long, depending on the report's length, but this is often a self-contained standalone document. Although this may not always be the case, executive summaries can make generate recommendations as well in general. And accuracy is essential because the decisions will be based on the executive summary by people who have not read the original document. So, what are the parts of an executive summary? Again, there should be purpose and scope, the methods, the results, conclusion, recommendations, and if necessary, especially if these are non medical people, other supportive information. So, in terms of writing an executive summary, it should be very brief, just one or a few pages long. A rule of thumb, the length of your executive summary should be between 5 to 10% of the full report or proposal. Again, we want you to minimize the use of medical terminologies, avoid jargon, understand that not everyone in the target audience may understand technical terms. Writing for medical experts will be vastly different from writing for people in finance. So ito yung sinasabi ko kanina, no? Content, discuss the major points in the same order as they appear in the full document. Refrain from introducing information not found in the proposal. Now, use bullet points to break down complex information, headings or subheadings to organize topics. If appropriate, use images to enhance the reader's understanding of the summary. And of course, before you send it to the possible financial people, have someone critique your research proposal. By the time you finish your full implementation, your research proposal can be converted into a final research manuscript. The final research manuscript is simpler in the sense that it only has the IMRAD, introduction, materials, results, then discussion. If your research proposal is something, because this is something that will happen in the future, it is often written in the future tense. Your final research manuscript, because you have already completed the study, it is now written using the past tense. So you can rearrange your proposal and then finally come up with your final research manuscript by the end of the first semester of your third year when you are done with the final research implementation. So I believe this is my last slide. Most of what I have discussed came from previous past chairs of the Department of Preventive and Community Medicine. Again, I'd like to um, acknowledge them because without their guidance and knowledge, the department will not be a powerhouse in student medical research because over the decades, we have proven our value and we have established our niche in terms of producing quality student research papers that are duly recognized not only in the Philippines but in other parts of Asia, the Pacific region, as well as other parts of the globe, including the Americas and, of course, the European nations. So, with that, I think this is my last slide. In case you will be having any questions or clarifications, you reach out to me via Canvas. You can send your questions or inquiries. You can use the message board or the discussion board in Canvas if you have questions, and if I will try my very best to answer your inquiries the soonest possible time. With that, again, we observe Breast Cancer Awareness Month this month of October, and I wish everyone the very best with the implementation, with the final writing of your research proposal. And we will see you soon in our beloved UERM MMCI. Thank you and good day to everyone.